Welcome, dear listener. Tonight I invite you to step into a quiet English village where the fog rolls thicker than secrets, and every footstep echoes with suspicion. On Alderwick Bridge, a place meant only for passing travelers, a life has been violently ended. The mist hides faces, the river keeps its silence, and every witness remembers something differently. But where truth blurs, one mind remains razor-sharp. Join Hercule Poirot as he untangles lies whispered through the fog, follows footprints that vanish into darkness, and exposes a murderer who believed the night would protect them. Settle in, lower the lights, and let the mystery begin. Chapter 1. The Body Beneath the Fog. The fog did not roll into Alderwick that morning. It settled. It arrived slowly, deliberately, as if the village had been holding its breath all night and finally exhaled something cold and suffocating. By dawn, Alderwick Bridge was no longer a crossing. It was a threshold, suspended between visibility and oblivion. The bridge itself was old, older than most living memory, built of grey stone worn smooth by centuries of footsteps. It arched over the river lawn like a patient relic of another age. Iron railings ran along its sides, blackened by time and damp, their surfaces slick with moisture. Two gas lanterns stood at either end, glowing weakly, their light swallowed almost immediately by the fog. At 5 minutes past 5, the bridge belonged to no one. At 6 minutes past 5, it changed everything. Thomas Bell adjusted the strap of his leather mailbag and slowed his pace as he approached the bridge. He had been Alderwick's postman for 12 years, long enough to know when something felt wrong. The fog itself did not trouble him. He had crossed this bridge in worse, but today the silence felt heavier. Even the river seemed muted. His boots echoed softly on the stone as he stepped onto the bridge. Halfway across, he noticed it in a subtle break in the uniform. Grey. A darker shape near the eastern parapet, where the bridge curved slightly toward the riverbank. Thomas stopped. He told himself it was nothing. A fallen coat, perhaps. A sack left by a careless farmer. Alderwick was full of such small inconveniences. Still his heart quickened. The smell reached him before clarity did. Damp wool, cold stone, and beneath it all, a metallic tang that did not belong to morning air. He took one cautious step closer, then another. The fog thinned just enough to reveal a shoe. A man's shoe, black leather, polished but scuffed at the toe, protruding at an unnatural angle from the mist. Thomas felt his throat tighten. His fingers curled instinctively around the strap of his bag as though it could anchor him. "Hello?" he called, his voice barely louder than the river below. No answer. The fog shifted again, and the rest of the body emerged. A man lay crumpled beside the parapet, half on his side, half face down. One arm was twisted beneath him, the other stretched outward, fingers grazing the stone as if frozen in a final, desperate reach. His coat was dark, finely tailored, the sort worn by men who expected to be noticed. Blood had pooled beneath his head, diluted by mist and dew, but unmistakable against the pale stone. Thomas screamed. The village awoke in fragments. A window slammed open, a door creaked, footsteps hurried, then stopped short. By the time Constable Hugh Mercer arrived, breathless and flustered, a small crowd had gathered. Though none dared step fully onto the bridge, they hovered at its edge, eyes wide, whispers colliding with one another. Mercer forced his way through, face pale beneath his mustache. He took one look at the body and swallowed hard. "Back," he said, raising a trembling hand. "Everyone back, please." He tied a length of rope across the bridge entrance, more symbolic than effective. But it gave the villagers something to respect, a boundary between themselves and what lay beyond. The man was identified quickly, Edgar Whitcomb. The name passed through the crowd like a sudden draft. Whitcomb owned the Riverside Textile Mill, the largest employer in Alderwick and its most controversial figure. He had arrived 5 years earlier, moneyed and confident, promising prosperity. And he had delivered it, but not without cost. Men worked longer hours, wages were fair, but kindness was rare. And Whitcomb never forgot a slight. Now he lay motionless, stripped of authority. His ambition ended on a bridge he likely never thought twice about. Mercer knelt carefully beside the body. There were no signs of a struggle, no torn clothing, no scattered belongings. Whitcomb's wallet remained in his coat. His gold pocket watch lay intact. Stopped at 2:17 a.m., robbery was out. "Accident?" a woman whispered from behind the rope. Mercer shook his head slowly. "No." Dr. Samuel Hargreaves arrived moments later, his spectacles fogged, his breath shallow. He examined the body in silence, then straightened. "One blow," he said quietly, "heavy, delivered from behind. Death would have been almost immediate. A single strike, in thick fog, on a bridge where everyone passed and no one noticed." Mercer felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. By late morning, the fog began to lift, just enough to reveal how exposed the bridge truly was. Tracks were useless, the stones were too wet, the fog too thorough. Mercer sent a telegram not to Scotland Yard, not to the county magistrate, but to a small hotel in the neighbouring county, where a Belgian gentleman had recently checked in under the pretense of rest. When Hercule Poirot read the message, he frowned thoughtfully. "A murder on a bridge," he murmured, "and in fog." He adjusted his moustache, displeased. "The fog," he continued, speaking as much to himself as to the room, "is the criminal's greatest illusion. People believe it hides the truth. In reality, it only reveals who is foolish enough to rely upon it." Poirot folded the telegram carefully and placed it in his pocket. "Prepare the car," he said calmly. "We are going to Alderwick." Behind him, the countryside remained peaceful, unaware that a quiet village had already begun to turn against itself, and that on Alderwick Bridge the truth waited patiently, unconcerned by mist, time, or fear. Chapter 2. Whispers in a Quiet Village. By the time Hercule Poirot arrived in Alderwick, the fog had lifted, but the village had not. Sunlight touched the stone cottages reluctantly, as if unsure whether it was welcome. Doors were open, yet people lingered inside them, peering out with guarded expressions. Conversation stopped the moment Poirot passed, only to resume in hushed fragments once he moved on. Poirot noticed everything. The way a woman tightened her shawl when she recognized him, the way a man turned his face away too quickly, the way silence settled, heavier than fog ever had. "Ah," Poirot murmured to himself, "a village that knows more than it wishes to say." Constable Hugh Mercer greeted him near the bridge, his posture stiff with relief. "Monsieur Poirot, thank heaven you came so quickly." Poirot inclined his head politely. "Murder is rarely patient, my friend. It prefers urgency." Mercer gestured toward the bridge. "We've kept it closed. No one has crossed since the body was found." Poirot's eyebrows rose slightly. "No one? Not even before the rope was placed?" "Well, people pass through Alderwick Bridge daily," Mercer admitted. "But that morning the fog was extraordinary." Poirot smiled thinly. "Yes, fog is always extraordinary, and when one wishes not to be seen." They began with the body. Dr. Hargreaves repeated his findings, careful and clinical. The blow had come from behind, a blunt object, heavy but compact, death swift, no prolonged struggle. Poirot knelt, studying the stone beside where Edgar Whitcomb had fallen. "The position," he said softly. "It suggests surprise. Your Mr. Whitcomb was not expecting an attack," Mercer nodded. "Everyone says he left the mill late, around 2 in the morning." "Everyone?" Poirot asked gently. "Well, several people," Mercer corrected himself. Poirot's moustache twitched. "A curious word, everyone," he said. "It is often used when one wishes to sound certain." The first house they visited belonged to Mrs. Clara Finch, whose cottage overlooked the bridge. She was a widow in her early 60s, neat to the point of severity, her sitting room immaculate. "I heard footsteps," she said firmly, "just after 2. Poirot leaned forward. "Footsteps going where, madame?" "Toward the bridge. Then nothing." "No. Voices?" "No." "No cry?" "No." Poirot nodded slowly. "And you looked out?" Mrs. Finch hesitated, just a fraction too long. "The fog was thick," she said. "There was nothing to see." Poirot thanked her warmly. Outside, he murmured, "She heard enough to know something happened, but not enough to help." Mercer frowned. "Meaning?" Poirot smiled. "Meaning she is afraid." Next came the mill. The textile building loomed over the river, its windows dark even in daylight. Inside, the machinery stood silent, as though holding its breath. The foreman, George Hallett, greeted them with clenched hands and a guarded stare. "Mr. Whitcomb left after an argument," Hallett admitted. "With Mr. Collins." Poirot's eyes sharpened. "Mr. Collins?" "A senior accountant," Hallett said. "Handled payroll. Whitcomb accused him of irregularities." And Mr. Collins? He left shortly after. Poirot made a note. Tell me, he said mildly, did Mr. Whitcomb make many enemies? Hallett laughed humorlessly. That depends on whether you call unpaid overtime an enemy maker. Poirot smiled, but his eyes were cold. They found Edward Collins in a rented room above the village shop. He was pale, nervous, his hands never quite still. Yes, he said quickly, we argued, but I left the mill and went straight home. At what hour? Poirot asked. 2:15. Poirot glanced at the stopped pocket watch. Interesting, he murmured. Your timing is precise. Collins swallowed. I checked the clock at home. Poirot leaned back. You see, Monsieur Collins, precision is often more suspicious than vagueness. Collins said nothing. As afternoon faded, Poirot asked to walk the bridge alone. Mercer hesitated. It's unsettling. All the better, Poirot replied. He paced slowly, counting steps, observing angles. He paused near the parapet. A man strikes from behind, he murmured. But from where? He crouched. The bridge lanterns were positioned unevenly, one casting longer shadows than the other. Poirot smiled. The fog hid the body, he said softly. But the light betrayed the killer's position. He stood, satisfied. That evening, Poirot dined at the inn, listening more than he spoke. Voices rose, fell, shifted. A name surfaced again and again. Edgar Whitcomb, feared, disliked, but tolerated. Poirot set down his fork. When many people wish a man dead, he said quietly, it does not mean they killed him. He folded his napkin. It means the murderer believed he could disappear among them. Outside, Alderwick Bridge stood quiet once more, but the fog had already done its work. Chapter 3. The lanterns that lied night returned to Alderwick like a familiar accomplice. By 8 o'clock, the inn's common room was quieter than it had any right to be. The villagers drank, yes, but not with the loose warmth of ordinary evenings. Their laughter came too late, their silences too early, and every time the inn door creaked, heads turned as if expecting the dead man himself to step inside. Poirot watched them from the corner table nearest the hearth, his posture composed, his gaze unhurried. He had the air of a man who might be thinking of nothing at all, and that was precisely what made people uneasy. Constable Mercer approached with a notebook tucked under his arm. Monsieur Poirot, may I? Poirot gestured to the chair. But of course, Mercer sat, lowering his voice. I've spoken to more villagers. Everyone has a theory. Some say the river took Whitcomb, some say he was meeting someone secretly, some say the mill workers wanted revenge. Poirot's eyes softened slightly. And what do you say, my friend? Mercer hesitated. I say none of them are telling the whole truth. Poirot nodded. Excellent, that is the beginning of intelligence. He sipped his tea, because for Poirot, even in a murder case, tea was a matter of discipline. Tell me, Poirot asked, how many people claim they were asleep at 2 in the morning? Mercer flipped open his notebook. Almost all of them. Poirot's mustache twitched. And how many admit they were awake? 3. Mercer cleared his throat. Mrs. Clara Finch, who says she heard footsteps. George Hallett, the mill foreman, who says Whitcomb left after an argument. And Edward Collins, the accountant. Poirot tapped the table lightly. 3, yes. And yet, the bridge itself suggests a 4th. Mercer frowned. A 4th? Poirot leaned forward. Someone who was not merely awake but watching. They left the inn together, stepping into a night colder than the day before. The river moved silently below, a ribbon of blackness. Alderwick Bridge loomed ahead, lanterns glowing like tired eyes. Poirot walked slowly, counting his steps, stopping at places that seemed meaningless to Mercer, but not to Poirot. You see these lanterns? Poirot asked, pointing with his cane. Yes, they are not identical. Poirot moved closer. This one, at the western end, is older. The glass is slightly clouded. It casts a softer light. The eastern lantern is newer, brighter, and it throws sharper shadows. Mercer stared. So? Poirot smiled. So the bridge does not lie. People do. He gestured toward the parapet where Whitcomb had fallen. Imagine, Mercer, 2 in the morning, the fog thick. A man walks the bridge. He is struck from behind. He falls here. No one sees, no one hears. And yet, someone claims to have heard footsteps. Mercer nodded. Mrs. Finch. Poirot turned to him. If she heard footsteps at just after 2, it means the bridge was not as silent as she wishes us to believe. The fog muffles sound, yes, but it does not erase it completely. Mercer's brow furrowed. Are you saying she heard more than she admits? Poirot's eyes gleamed. I am saying she heard enough to know there were 2 people. Mercer stiffened. 2? Poirot crouched near the parapet, his fingers tracing something Mercer had missed entirely. A faint smear, not blood. Blood would have been obvious. This was darker, thinner, as if something wet had been dragged and then wiped away. Poirot inhaled gently. Oil, he murmured. Machine oil. Mercer blinked. From the mill. Perhaps, Poirot replied, rising. Or from something carried from the mill. He walked a few paces, then stopped again. There is another detail. He pointed at the stone near the bridge's midpoint. Do you see that? Mercer leaned in. It looks like a scratch. Poirot nodded. A scrape. Something hard struck the stone here. Not a shoe, not a cane. Something heavier. Mercer swallowed. The murder weapon? Poirot's smile was small. Possibly, but more interesting is why it struck here. He lifted his cane and tapped the air. A man who strikes from behind on a narrow bridge must stand close, very close. Yet the body fell near the parapet. That means the victim was closer to the railing than to the center. Mercer frowned. So he was leaning, looking down? Or meeting someone, Poirot said softly. Perhaps the victim stepped aside. Perhaps he was speaking quietly in the fog. Perhaps he trusted the person enough to move closer. Poirot looked across the bridge toward Mrs. Finch's cottage, and someone else watched. The next morning, Poirot requested to visit the mill again, but not to speak with the foreman. He wanted the ledger room. The mill's accounts were kept in a narrow office with tall shelves and the smell of paper dust. Edward Collins arrived reluctantly, his collar too tight, his eyes too sharp. You want to see the books? Collins asked. I want to see what Mr. Whitcomb cared about, Poirot replied. Because what a man values often reveals why he dies. Collins unlocked the cabinet with a key that trembled slightly in his hand. Poirot observed that tremor carefully. He examined the ledgers slowly, not reading every number. He did not need to. He watched Collins instead. When Poirot flipped to a page marked with a ribbon, Collins's breathing changed. Poirot turned the page back and smiled. Ah, he murmured. This is the interesting part. Collins forced a laugh. It's just payroll. Nothing unusual. Poirot tilted his head. Nothing unusual? Then why did Mr. Whitcomb accuse you of irregularities? Collins stiffened. He was paranoid. Poirot's voice remained gentle. Or he was correct, Collins swallowed. I told you, I left at 2:15. Poirot nodded, as if accepting it. Then he asked quietly, Why is the ink on this page still fresh? Collins froze. Mercer stepped forward. Fresh? Poirot pointed delicately. See the slight sheen, the faint smudge where the paper has been handled. This entry was written recently, perhaps yesterday, perhaps even this morning. Collins's face drained of color. Poirot's tone remained almost kind. Monsieur Collins, are you falsifying records after the death of Edgar Whitcomb? Collins opened his mouth, closed it, then shook his head too quickly. No, of course not. Poirot turned away as though uninterested, but Mercer caught the look in Poirot's eyes, the look that meant he had just found a crack. They left the mill, walking along the river path back toward the village. Mercer spoke first. So Collins is lying? Poirot shrugged lightly. Lying, yes, but lying does not always mean murder. Sometimes it means fear. Sometimes it means guilt of another kind. He stopped by the riverbank, looking toward Alderwick Bridge in the distance. Consider this, Poirot said softly. A man like Whitcomb keeps power through control, of wages, of secrets, of people. If Collins was stealing from him, Whitcomb would ruin him. Mercer nodded. So Collins had motive. Yes, Poirot agreed. But motive is common, opportunity is rarer, and knowledge is rarer still. Poirot turned toward Mercer. The fog helped the killer, he said. But the lanterns helped more, because the lanterns created shadows, and shadows create places to hide. Mercer looked troubled. And you think someone was watching from Mrs. Finch's cottage? Poirot nodded. I think someone was watching from somewhere. Mrs. Finch is one possibility. Another is the mill itself. Another is the river path. He began walking again. And now, Poirot added, we shall discover which. That afternoon, Poirot did something unusual. He asked Mercer to gather a small group at the inn, not a full confrontation, not yet, just a casual meeting. Mrs. Finch arrived, severe and rigid. George Hallett came, arms crossed, defensive. Edward Collins appeared last, avoiding everyone's eyes. Poirot greeted them with polite warmth. Mesdames et messieurs, he said, I apologize for disturbing your day, but I have a simple question. They stared. Poirot smiled. At 2 a.m. on the night of the murder, which one of you saw the lantern on the eastern end flicker? A silence fell so heavy it seemed to smother the room. Mrs. Finch's fingers tightened on her handbag. Hallett's jaw clenched. Collins's throat bobbed as he swallowed. Poirot's smile did not fade. Because that flicker had not been in any report, Mercer had never mentioned it, the villagers had never discussed it publicly. Only someone who was there, who was awake and watching, would know. And in that moment, Poirot knew something else as well. The fog had hidden the murder, but the lanterns had lied. Chapter 4. The alibi that slipped morning returned to Alderwick with a deceptive calm. Sunlight warmed the stone cottages, the river moved gently, and the bridge stood exposed at last. No fog, no mystery to shield it. And yet the village felt more tightly wound than ever. Secrets had a way of growing heavier once daylight stripped away their disguises. Hercule Poirot stood near the eastern lantern, hands clasped behind his back, eyes fixed not on the river, but on the stones beneath his feet. Mercer, he said softly, tell me again precisely where the body was found. Constable Hugh Mercer gestured. Here, Monsieur Poirot, near the parapet, head toward the river, feet angled slightly inward. Poirot nodded. And the blood? Mostly, here, some seepage toward the edge. Poirot crouched slowly, studying the stonework. In daylight, what had been invisible now revealed itself. Faint scuffing, shallow marks worn into the damp stone. These are not new, Mercer said. Poirot smiled faintly. Ah, but this one is? He pointed to a narrow indentation close to the parapet, not deep enough to be damage, not wide enough to be accidental. Something heavy struck here, Poirot murmured, and then it was removed. Mercer frowned. You think the weapon was taken away? I am certain of it, Poirot replied. A murderer who relies on fog relies also on preparation. Poirot requested one thing next, the lantern itself. The eastern lantern was opened carefully. Inside, the glass bore a faint smudge, greasy, not from soot. Poirot inhaled gently. Oil again. From the mill, Mercer asked. Perhaps, Poirot replied. Or from hands accustomed to machinery. Mercer stiffened. George Hallett. Poirot did not answer immediately. Before we accuse, he said calmly, we must understand timing. George Hallett's alibi had seemed solid. He claimed he left the mill shortly after Edgar Whitcomb, around 2 a.m, and walked home along the river path. No bridge crossing, no lanterns, no fog-shrouded meeting. But Poirot disliked alibis that were too smooth. They found Hallett behind the mill, overseeing deliveries with an impatience that bordered on irritation. Monsieur Hallett, Poirot said pleasantly, may we trouble you for a moment? Hallett wiped his hands on a rag. I've already answered questions. Indeed, Poirot replied, but not mine. They walked along the river path together. Poirot let silence do its work. Tell me, Poirot said at last, when you left the mill that night, did you notice anything unusual? Hallett hesitated. No fog, Poirot pressed gently. Of course there was fog, Poirot nodded. And the lanterns on the bridge? I didn't cross the bridge. Poirot stopped walking. Ah, he said softly. But I did not ask if you crossed it. Hallett's jaw tightened. Poirot continued, voice calm. Only someone who was near enough to see the lanterns would think to mention them. Hallett flushed. Everyone knows the lanterns. Poirot smiled. Not whether one flickered. Hallett said nothing. That afternoon, Poirot visited Mrs. Clara Finch again. Her cottage smelled of lavender and restraint. She greeted him with politeness, sharpened by unease. You said you heard footsteps, Poirot reminded her gently. Did they stop? Yes, she replied quickly, on the bridge. And then? Nothing. Poirot leaned forward. Madame Finch, have you ever walked the bridge at night? She nodded, reluctantly. Then you know, Poirot continued, that sound carries strangely. You would hear voices if people spoke. She swallowed. They didn't speak, Poirot tilted his head. Or you did not wish to hear them. Her fingers tightened around her teacup. Poirot stood. Thank you, madame. You have been most helpful. Outside, Mercer whispered. She's hiding something, Poirot nodded. Yes, but fear is not murder. The breakthrough came from the river. A boy fishing downstream had discovered something lodged between stones near the bank. Heavy, rusted, wrapped partially in cloth. Mercer brought it to Poirot at once. A metal coupling, industrial, stained dark. Poirot examined it carefully. This, he said quietly, is our missing sentence. Mercer blinked. The weapon? Indeed, heavy enough, compact, easily concealed, and familiar to someone from the mill. Mercer's face hardened. Hallett! Poirot raised a finger. Patience. He turned the coupling over. A marking was etched faintly into the metal, a repair number. Poirot smiled. Every object wishes to be returned to its place. They found the matching record in the mill's maintenance logs. The coupling had been removed weeks earlier, officially replaced, but no replacement receipt existed. Poirot tapped the page. Someone kept it. And used it, Mercer said. Yes, Poirot agreed. But who? That evening, Poirot summoned Hallett and Collins separately. First, Edward Collins. The accountant's hands trembled openly now. You falsified records, Poirot said calmly. Why? Collins broke. Whitcomb was stealing from the workers, skimming. I adjusted the books to hide it, to give them back. Poirot nodded. A noble lie. But I didn't kill him, Collins insisted. I went. Home, I swear. Poirot believed him. Then came George Hallett. You argued with Whitcomb, Poirot said. You had access to the coupling. You knew the bridge. Hallett's face darkened. He ruined people, families. But did you kill him? Poirot asked softly. Hallett shook his head violently. No, I followed him. Yes, I wanted to scare him, to threaten him. Poirot's eyes sharpened. You followed him to the bridge. Yes, but someone else was already there. Silence fell. A woman, Hallett whispered, waiting, near the lantern. Poirot closed his eyes briefly. Merci, he said. That is all. When Mercer asked later who the killer was, Poirot answered quietly. Someone who knew the bridge, someone who watched from safety, someone whose fear turned into resolve. He looked toward Mrs. Finch's cottage. The alibi has slipped, Poirot said, and tomorrow the truth will walk into daylight. Chapter 5, A Fear That Turned Fatal. The night before Poirot acted, Alderwick did not sleep. Curtains twitched behind cottage windows. Lanterns were extinguished earlier than usual. Even the innkeeper spoke in a whisper, as though the walls themselves might report him. The village had reached that dangerous stage where suspicion no longer searched for truth. It searched for relief. And relief, Poirot knew, would come only when one person stood alone. Hercule Poirot sat in his room at the inn, a small fire crackling softly. On the table before him lay three things: the mill maintenance log, the river-stained coupling wrapped in cloth, and a simple village map. Poirot arranged them with care. Facts, he murmured, are like people. Alone they are vague. Together they become impossible to ignore. He tapped the map gently with one finger. Alderwick Bridge, Mrs. Finch's cottage, the river path, the mill, all within sight, all within reach. The murderer, Poirot continued softly, did not plan to kill that night, but she planned to be there. Earlier that day, Poirot had returned once more to Mrs. Clara Finch's cottage, this time without Mercer. She opened the door slowly, her expression guarded but resigned. "Monsieur Poirot," she said, "I wondered when you would come again." Poirot inclined his head. "And I wondered when you would stop pretending." She turned away without a word, allowing him inside. The sitting room was immaculate as always, but Poirot noticed something new, a faint smell of oil, poorly masked by lavender. "Madame Finch," Poirot said gently, "you are a woman who notices everything. Too much, perhaps." She stiffened. "I keep my windows clean." "Yes," Poirot agreed. "And your eyes sharper still." He sat opposite her. "You saw Edgar Whitcomb that night," Poirot said calmly, "not merely passing, but stopping." Her hands clenched. "You heard his voice," Poirot continued, "and another." Silence. Poirot leaned forward. "You did not kill him at first, you watched." Her breath shuddered. "I was afraid," she whispered. "Of him," Poirot nodded. "Fear is honest, but what happened next was not accidental." She looked up sharply. "I didn't plan it." Poirot smiled sadly. "No, you reacted." The truth emerged in fragments. Edgar Whitcomb had come to her weeks earlier, not as a neighbor, but as a threat. He knew about her late husband's financial irregularities at the mill years ago, old records, old debts, matters long buried. "He said," she whispered, "you live comfortably for a widow." Poirot's eyes darkened. "He told me I could keep my peace," she continued, "if I helped him, watched, listened, reported, a village watcher. He said people talk near my windows," she said bitterly, "and I hear—" "Everything," Poirot nodded. "And you did." That night, Whitcomb met George Hallett on the bridge. Hallett followed him, angry but unarmed, intending only to threaten. Mrs. Finch watched from her window. Then Edward Collins appeared briefly, not to meet Whitcomb, but to follow at a distance, intending to confront him later. Collins turned back before reaching the bridge, but Mrs. Finch did not know that. "All I saw," she whispered, "were shadows, men, secrets." Poirot's voice was gentle. "And when Whitcomb turned on Halley, he laughed," she said, tears forming. "He said he owned all of us." Poirot closed his eyes briefly. "And then," he said softly, "you went to the bridge." She nodded. "I took the coupling from my shed," she whispered. "Hallett had left it there months ago. I didn't even think." Poirot finished the sentence for her. "Until you struck." She covered her face. "I didn't mean to kill him," she sobbed. "But when he fell, when I saw the blood, I knew there was no going back." Poirot let silence sit between them. "You cleaned the lantern," he said gently. "You wiped the coupling. You threw it into the river. And you lied, not well, but well enough." She nodded weakly. That evening, Poirot told Mercer everything. The constable listened, stunned. "She planned to watch," Mercer said slowly. "Not to murder." "Yes," Poirot replied, "but watching can be dangerous when fear is involved." Mercer ran a hand through his hair. "She used everyone else as camouflage." Poirot nodded. "She hid behind the village itself." To the next morning, Poirot requested everyone to gather at the inn. Mrs. Finch arrived last. Poirot stood at the head of the room, calm and precise. "Last night," he said, "I learned something important about Alderwick, not about its people, but about its habits." He gestured toward Mrs. Finch. "This woman is observant. She knows when lights flicker, when voices change, when footsteps hesitate." Mrs. Finch trembled. Poirot continued, "She did not plan a murder, but she planned to be present, and presence, mes amis, is opportunity." He lifted the cloth from the coupling. "A tool from the mill, familiar, heavy, easily mistaken for necessity rather than intent." Mrs. Finch broke down completely. "I was afraid," she cried. "He would destroy me." Poirot's voice softened. "Fear explains much, but it does not excuse all." Mercer stepped forward. Mrs. Finch did not resist. As she was led away, the village seemed to exhale for the first time since the fog had arrived. That afternoon, Poirot stood once more on Alderwick Bridge. The river flowed calmly beneath. The bridge, Poirot murmured, did not kill Edgar Whitcomb, nor did the fog. He adjusted his moustache. It was fear, given a moment and a weapon. Chapter 6. The Silence After Truth. The arrest of Mrs. Clara Finch did not bring celebration to Alderwick. It brought quiet, not the peaceful quiet of a village returned to normal, but the uneasy hush that follows when people realize how close danger has lived beside them, how long it has shared their routines, their greetings, their trust. Windows closed earlier that evening, lanterns were lit later, and the bridge, once merely a way across the river, had become something else entirely, a reminder. Hercule Poirot observed all of this without comment. He had learned long ago that the aftermath of truth was often heavier than the truth itself. The following morning, Poirot walked alone along the river path. Mist rose faintly from the water, not the suffocating fog of the murder night, but a thin veil, almost apologetic. Birds returned to the reeds. The river resumed its quiet gossip with the stones. Life, it seemed, was eager to move on. Poirot was not. He paused where the coupling had been found, crouching briefly as though the river might yet speak again. But rivers, like people, reveal only what they wish. You did your part, Poirot murmured softly. Now you forget. He straightened and continued toward the bridge. In daylight, Alderwick Bridge looked almost harmless. Children had begun crossing it again, darting past one another, laughing, though their laughter softened instinctively at the midpoint, as if memory itself lingered there. Poirot rested his hands on the railing. It is always this way, he reflected. A place becomes guilty by association. Constable Mercer joined him shortly afterward. They're taking her to the county jail, Mercer said quietly. She confessed fully. Poirot nodded. That is good. Mercer hesitated. Is it? Poirot turned. Truth is not comfort. Mercer, it is clarity. Comfort comes later, if at all. Mercer exhaled slowly. The village is shaken. As it should be, Poirot replied. A village that is never shaken believes itself innocent by default. They walked together toward the inn. Along the way, they passed George Hallett, who stood outside the mill gates staring at the river. He hasn't said much, Mercer noted. Keeps to himself. Poirot studied Hallett thoughtfully. He followed Whitcomb that night, Poirot said. Anger brought him close, but anger alone did not make him a killer. Mercer nodded. And Collins, Poirot smiled faintly. A man who lies to protect others is dangerous only to himself. That afternoon, Poirot requested a final meeting, not with suspects, but with the village council. They gathered in the inn's private room, farmers, shopkeepers, elders who had lived their entire lives within sight of the bridge. Poirot addressed them calmly. Edgar Whitcomb came to your village with power, he said. Power of money, power of employment, power of fear. Several heads bowed. He used your knowledge against you, Poirot continued, and in doing so he created the conditions for his own death. A murmur passed through the room. Poirot raised a hand gently. This does not excuse murder. But it explains how silence becomes complicit, no one argued. You will rebuild trust slowly, Poirot said, or you will not rebuild it at all. That choice is yours. That evening, Poirot prepared to leave Alderwick. He packed his things carefully, folding his clothes with precision. Disorder, he believed, should be reserved for crime scenes, not luggage. At the doorway, Mercer paused. Monsieur Poirot, may I ask something? Of course. Do you think Mrs. Finch would have killed if Whitcomb hadn't frightened her? Poirot considered this carefully. No, he said at last. But that does not mean Whitcomb killed himself. Mercer nodded, understanding. Fear, Poirot continued softly, is like fog. It makes people believe the world is smaller than it truly is. And when people feel trapped, they act. The train departed just after dawn. Poirot took a window seat, his reflection faint in the glass. As Alderwick slipped away, the bridge appeared one last time, small, stone, unremarkable. Poirot allowed himself a thin smile. A bridge, he murmured, is meant to connect, but sometimes it reveals who stands on which side of conscience. The countryside unfolded beyond, green and indifferent. Another mystery solved, another village changed forever, and somewhere, Poirot knew, another fog was already forming, waiting for someone to believe it could hide the truth. Chapter 7. The Weight of... Knowing the train carried Hercule Poirot away from Alderwick, but Alderwick did not leave him. As the countryside unfolded beyond the window, hedgerows, fields, the occasional church spire, Poirot remained still, hands folded, eyes thoughtful. There were cases that delighted his intellect, puzzles that danced elegantly until the final reveal. And then there were cases like this one, where understanding brought no satisfaction, only gravity. He disliked those most of all. Poirot disembarked not at London, but at a smaller station an hour beyond. He had chosen a detour, a habit of his when he wished to think without interruption. The air was clearer here, the light less burdened by smoke or memory. He walked slowly along a gravel path bordering a canal, listening to the water slide past its banks. It reminded him, uncomfortably, of the river lawn. "The mind," Poirot murmured, "is very much like water. It reflects what is placed. Above it, and above Alderwick had hovered fear." Back in the village, the consequences of truth were unfolding in quieter ways. George Hallett arrived at the mill before sunrise, unlocking the gates with hands that felt heavier than they had ever been. The coupling had been replaced. New machinery gleamed where old metal once bore the scars of labor, yet nothing felt repaired. Men arrived for their shifts, nodding to one another without speaking. Work resumed, as it always did, but the rhythm was wrong, too careful, too restrained. Hallett stared at the floor where Whitcomb once stood and gave orders with a voice that lacked authority, as though he no longer trusted himself to wield it. Edward Collins packed his belongings that same morning. He had decided to leave Alderwick, not because anyone had accused him, but because staying meant remembering every ledger, every altered line, every compromise made in the name of fairness. He folded his shirts precisely, avoiding the mirror. "Good intentions," he whispered, "do not absolve silence." He closed the door behind him and did not look back. At Mrs. Finch's cottage, the windows remained shuttered. No lavender drifted from the doorway, no neat curtains softened the glass. The house stood empty, not abandoned, but stripped of presence. Villagers passed it quickly, eyes averted, as though guilt might be contagious. A young girl paused one afternoon, staring at the closed door. "Why doesn't she live there anymore?" she asked her mother. The woman tightened her grip. "Because some houses keep secrets too long." Poirot learned all of this later, through letters and reports. He read them carefully in a quiet hotel room, his expression unreadable. When he finished, he folded the papers and placed them in his pocket. "The ripple," he said softly. "There is always the ripple." He stood and approached the window. Below, a market bustled, life proceeding with its remarkable indifference to tragedy. Poirot smiled faintly. "It is not the murderer who troubles me," he reflected. "It is the ones who almost became one." That evening, Poirot dined alone. At the neighboring table, two men spoke in low tones about a local scandal. A shopkeeper caught cheating customers. One said the man deserved punishment, the other said the pressure of debt explained everything. Poirot listened without comment. Later, as he prepared to retire, he paused before the mirror, adjusting his moustache with practiced care. "Justice," he said quietly, "is not a blade, it is a scale, and scales required balance." The following day, Poirot received a letter from Constable Mercer. It was short. The village council had voted to install new lanterns on Alderwick Bridge. Brighter, evenly spaced, modern. Some believed it would help erase memory. Poirot sighed. "They misunderstand," he murmured. "Light does not erase. it reveals. He folded the letter and wrote a brief reply, advising patience and humility. That night, Poirot dreamed. He stood once more on Alderwick Bridge, fog curling at his feet. Voices whispered from the mist, not accusations, but questions. The lantern flickered endlessly, never going out, never steady. Poirot awoke unsettled. Dreams, he knew, were the mind's way of sorting what logic could not finish. By morning, he was himself again. He packed his bags, checked his itinerary, and prepared for the next destination, the next puzzle, the next set of secrets waiting to be exposed. Yet, as he stepped onto the platform, he paused. Alderwick, he thought, will not forget, nor would he, because some mysteries, even when solved, leave behind a residue, a quiet awareness that evil does not always arrive with violence. Sometimes it arrives politely, with paperwork, with threats whispered softly, with fear that waits patiently for a moment of weakness. Poirot straightened his coat and boarded the train, and as the engine pulled away, he allowed himself one final reflection. To know the truth, he murmured, is a burden, but to refuse it is far heavier. Chapter 8. What the fog could not take. The letter arrived on thick cream paper, its edges precise, its handwriting unmistakably careful. Hercule Poirot recognized Constable Mercer's hand at once. He opened it slowly, not from habit, but from respect. Letters written after a case was closed were rarely about facts. They were about aftermath. Monsieur Poirot, Alderwick is quieter now. Too quiet, perhaps. The bridge has been reopened, the lanterns replaced, but people still slow their steps at the center. I thought you should know. Poirot folded the letter and placed it beside his teacup. Yes, he murmured, that is always the way. Alderwick had changed in ways no vote or repair could reverse. The new lanterns burned brighter, whiter, their light sharp and modern. They erased shadows, but not memory. At night the bridge no longer belonged to fog, yet villagers still avoided eye contact there, as though something unseen might yet demand acknowledgement. The river flowed as it always had, but its sound now carried weight. Children crossed the bridge again, but never lingered. Couples walked faster than before, and when strangers passed through, they did so unaware that the stones beneath their feet had once borne fear, rage, and a choice that could not be undone. Mrs. Finch's trial moved swiftly. Her confession spared the village spectacle, but not shame. The court heard of threats, coercion, fear cultivated patiently over years. It heard of a moment when terror tipped into violence, not premeditated but not forgivable. She pleaded guilty. When asked if she wished to say anything in her defense, she answered simply, I believed watching would protect me. I was wrong. Those words traveled through Alderwick faster than any verdict. Poirot attended none of it. He never did. Trials to him were echoes. The truth had already spoken. Instead, he took rooms in a coastal town far from rivers and bridges. There he walked the shoreline in the mornings, the sea stretching endlessly before him, honest, relentless, incapable of hiding what it took. He liked the sea for that reason. Fog, he reflected, belongs to land. The sea prefers clarity. One afternoon, Poirot encountered a young woman sketching near the cliffs. She looked up startled, then smiled politely. You're Belgian, she said. I can tell. Poirot raised an eyebrow. Ah, and how? Your accent, she replied, and the way you stand, very certain. Poirot smiled. They spoke briefly of nothing important, the weather, the view, the stubbornness of English tea. As he left, she called after him, You look like someone who solves problems. Poirot paused, then turned. I do, he said gently. But sometimes, mademoiselle, the problem is knowing what remains after they are solved. In Alderwick, life continued. George Hallett was promoted officially to mill manager, though the title sat awkwardly on him. He ran the mill fairly, transparently, and without threats. Some said productivity dipped. Others said morale improved. Edward Collins wrote once, a careful letter, apologetic, relieved. He had taken work elsewhere, this time refusing shortcuts. The book's balance, he wrote, and so do I. Mercer, pinned the letter to his desk for a time, then removed it. He preferred not to romanticize outcomes. The village had learned enough illusions already. Late one evening, Mercer walked the bridge alone. The lanterns glowed steadily, no flicker, no shadow deep enough to hide a person. He paused at the midpoint. The spot where Edgar Whitcomb had fallen was indistinguishable now, scrubbed clean, worn smooth by passing feet. Only Mercer knew precisely where it had been. He took off his cap briefly, not for Whitcomb, but for the lesson. Months later, Poirot received another letter, shorter than the first. Monsieur Poirot, I now understand what you meant when you said fear makes the world smaller. Alderwick is learning to breathe again. With respect, H. Mercer Poirot folded it carefully and placed it with the others. He allowed himself a small smile. Then, he said softly, something good has come of it. That night, Poirot dreamed again, but differently. No fog, only the bridge, bathed in even light. People crossed freely, voices carried naturally. No one watched from windows, no one waited in fear. Poirot stood at the edge, unseen. When he awoke, the unease was gone. The following morning, Poirot boarded another train, another destination, another quiet compartment. Across from him sat a man reading a newspaper, its headline bold, "Local businessman arrested after years of coercion." Poirot glanced once, then looked away. Patterns repeated everywhere. Alderwick had not been unique. It had merely been honest enough to confront itself. As the train gathered speed, Poirot reflected one final time on the bridge. The fog, he thought, did not cause the murder. It merely revealed who had been living in it all along. He adjusted his moustache and prepared, as always, for the next truth, waiting patiently to be uncovered. Chapter 9. The Bridge Without Shadows. The bridge looked different now, not because of the lanterns, nor because of the repairs, but because Alderwick had finally learned how to see it. In the late afternoon, when the sun slanted low and the river reflected bands of amber and steel, people crossed Alderwick Bridge without pausing. They still remembered. Memory does not evaporate simply because light improves, but remembrance had softened into understanding, and understanding, Poirot believed, was the truest form of closure. In a quiet coastal hotel miles away, Hercule Poirot read the final report from the county magistrate. The language was formal, the conclusions precise. Justice on paper had been served. Poirot set the document aside and gazed out at the sea. Paper, he murmured, is very good at endings. Life prefers continuations. Back in Alderwick, those continuations took many shapes. George Hallett introduced an open ledger system at the mill. Wages were posted weekly, decisions were discussed, not dictated. The men were slower at first, unaccustomed to being trusted, but the atmosphere changed. Authority, when shared, proved lighter. Edward Collins sent one last letter, this time not to Mercer, but to the mill workers themselves. It was brief, apologetic, and unsigned. No one knew where he had gone, only that he had chosen distance over concealment. And Mrs. Finch's cottage, once immaculate, then shuttered, was finally opened again. Not by her, by a young couple newly married, unaware of its history, eager only for a place with river views and quiet evenings. Some villagers objected at first, but Poirot would have smiled at how quickly they stopped. Places, like people, must be allowed to change owners. On an overcast morning, Constable Mercer stood at the bridge with a notebook in his pocket, not to record evidence, but to record habits. He had learned that crimes often announce themselves not with drama, but with repetition. He noticed who crossed together, who crossed alone, who avoided the bridge entirely. One detail caught his eye. Mrs. Finch's former window no longer faced the bridge with scrutiny. The curtains were light, open, unguarded. No watcher lived there now. Mercer closed his notebook. "Good," he said quietly. Poirot arrived in Alderwick once more without announcement. He did not often return to solved cases, but this one had left him with a question that logic alone could not answer. Mercer greeted him at the station, surprise evident. "Monsieur Poirot, I didn't expect—" "I know," Poirot replied warmly. "That is why I came." They walked together toward the bridge, the village greeting Poirot with nods rather than stares. That, Poirot observed, is progress. At the midpoint of Alderwick Bridge, Poirot stopped. He closed his eyes, not for long, just long enough to confirm something he already knew. "There are no shadows here anymore," he said. Mercer looked around. "The lanterns are even now." "Yes," Poirot agreed, "but that is not what I mean." He opened his eyes. "People no longer stand still here." Mercer smiled faintly. "We learned," Poirot nodded. "Learning is expensive." They sat later in the inn, sharing tea. The common room hummed gently, conversation, laughter, the clink of cups. No one whispered. "Tell me," Poirot asked, "do they speak of Edgar Whitcomb?" "Less," Mercer replied. "And when they do, it's measured." Poirot approved. "To demonize is to simplify," he said, "and simplification breeds repetition." As dusk settled, Poirot prepared to leave again. At the doorway, Mercer hesitated. "Monsieur Poirot, may I ask something personal?" Poirot inclined his head. "You may try." "Do you ever regret knowing," Mercer asked, "knowing how close ordinary people come to crossing lines?" Poirot considered this carefully. "No," he said at last, "but I regret how often they believe they are alone when they do." Mercer nodded. Poirot continued gently. "We are always watched, by conscience, if nothing else." That night, Alderwick Bridge lay quiet under steady light. No fog, no watcher, no waiting. A couple crossed slowly, talking of nothing important. A dog paused to sniff the stones, then trotted on. Life flowed. From a distance, Poirot watched once more, not as an investigator, but as a witness, and for the first time since the murder, he felt satisfied, not because the case was solved, that had been true for some time, but because the bridge no longer belonged to the crime. On the train the next morning, Poirot wrote a short note to himself, something he did rarely, and only when a case touched him more than expected. Truth is not the opposite of fog. It is the willingness to walk forward despite it. He folded the note, placed it in his pocket, and closed his eyes as the train moved on. Chapter 10, The Crossing That Remained. The end of a case is rarely dramatic. There is no thunder, no final gasp from the world itself. Only a quiet recognition that something irreversible has occurred. In Alderwick, that recognition settled slowly, like dusk easing across the river. The murder was over, the truth was known, and yet the bridge remained. On a cool morning touched with early autumn, Hercule Poirot stood once more at the edge of Alderwick Bridge. Not because the case demanded it, but because he did. He had learned over many years that places remembered crimes longer than people did. A village might forgive, a court might conclude, but stone, water, and iron absorbed memory without judgment. Poirot rested his gloved hand on the railing. "This," he murmured, "is where it always ends." The bridge was busy enough now. A delivery cart rattled across, the driver humming tunelessly. Two schoolboys ran past, arguing over something trivial and eternal. An elderly man paused midway, leaning on his cane, not in fear but in habit, before continuing on. Life had reclaimed the crossing, and yet Poirot noticed the smallest things. People no longer walked close to the parapet. No one stopped near the eastern lantern, and when fog drifted faintly over the river, feet unconsciously quickened. The body had been removed, the blood had been scrubbed away, but knowledge had found a permanent residence. Poirot met Constable Mercer one last time that afternoon. They sat on a bench overlooking the river, neither man in a hurry to speak. "The council has asked if the bridge should be renamed," Mercer said at last. "Something less connected." Poirot shook his head gently. "Renaming is a kind of forgetting. Forgetting is rarely wise." Mercer smiled ruefully. "That's what I told them." Poirot nodded approvingly. "To remember," he continued, "is not to relive. It is to recognize." Mercer hesitated, then asked, "Do you ever think, if one thing had been different?" Poirot turned to him. "One thing is always different," he said calmly. "That is how we pretend the world is simple. He gestured toward the bridge. If Whitcomb had been kinder, if Mrs. Finch had spoken sooner, if Hallett had turned back earlier, if Collins had trusted honesty over correction. Poirot's eyes softened. But the world does not move by ifs, Mercer. It moves by choices. Later, Poirot walked alone through the village one final time. The mill hummed steadily. The inn welcomed strangers again. Mrs. Finch's cottage glowed with unfamiliar warmth. New voices, new laughter, no ghosts invited. Poirot paused there only briefly. Houses, he reflected, are innocent. It is we who burden them. As evening approached, a light mist began to rise from the river. Thin, harmless, nothing like the suffocating fog of that fatal night. Poirot stood at the bridge's midpoint. He closed his eyes. He did not see the body. He did not hear the scream. He did not imagine the strike. Instead, he pictured the moment before, a man walking confidently, a watcher believing fear was protection, a village mistaking silence for safety. Poirot opened his eyes. Ah, he said softly, there it is. The final truth of Alderwick was not who killed Edgar Whitcomb. It was this. The murder did not happen because the night was dark. It happened because too many people had learned to look away. And when fear is shared quietly enough, it becomes permission. That night, Poirot stayed in Alderwick for the last time. From his window he could see the bridge clearly, evenly lit, unremarkable, peaceful. A passerby crossed it slowly, paused, then continued on. Poirot smiled. To cross, he murmured, is to accept that something lies on the other side. The following morning, Poirot departed. No crowds gathered, no speeches were made. Mercer shook his hand firmly at the station, gratitude contained but unmistakable. If you ever return, Mercer said, you'll be welcome. Poirot inclined his head. I hope I do not need to. As the train pulled away, Alderwick slipped gently from view. Cottages, mill, river, and finally the bridge itself. Poirot watched until it disappeared. In his compartment, Poirot removed a small notebook, not his case notes, but a personal one. He wrote only a single line, carefully, as though committing something sacred to paper. Justice ends a crime. Understanding prevents the next. He closed the notebook. Outside, the countryside passed in quiet rhythm. Another case concluded, another truth born, and somewhere, perhaps even now, a bridge waited. Not for a body, but for a choice. Poirot straightened his coat, adjusted his moustache, and allowed himself a moment of stillness. For he knew what most never learned. A murder is never just an act. It is a failure of attention, and vigilance, calm, patient, humane, was the only answer that endured. Epilogue. Note for the listener. Thank you for walking this bridge. Not every mystery asks to be solved. Some ask only to be noticed.